you can. All right, thanks for being here, everyone. So today we have Tennyson Liu and Nicolas Astorga from University of Cambridge. So they're in the Mihaela van der Schaars lab. And yeah, really glad that they're going to speak about their iClear 2024 paper on large language models to enhance Bayesian optimization. So very cool work and looking forward to it. And the floor is all yours, Tennyson and Nicolas.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the invitation, Arbor. And yeah, we're pretty excited to be talking about our work. And I think how we're going to do this is I'm going to do the first half, and Nicholas will do the second half. So you'll be hearing from Nicholas in a bit. Yeah. So this work was done also with Nabil Sidat, who's also from the lab, and supervised by Mihaela. And yeah, the title or the premise is using large language models to enhance Bayesian optimization. And just a little bit of background, I suppose everyone here is pretty familiar with this. So Bayesian optimization is a model-based framework to optimize a certain type of function. And these type of functions are usually pretty expensive to evaluate, and they're black box functions. And just a little bit of notation, like we want to find the h that minimizes some sort of function f. And when we try to solve these problems, we want to be as sample efficient as possible because they're very expensive to evaluate. And because they're usually black box, we only have zeroth order information. And we can't use gradients generally to solve these problems. And often it's the case that we also have very noisy observations of the function. Yeah, Bayesian optimization is a type of method that addresses the black box optimization, and it does so by iteratively refining its search, and usually by incorporating some sort of prior knowledge. And the goal is to find optimal solutions with as few samples as possible. And model-based BO has a few key components, one of which is the surrogate model. And the surrogate model is a model that is learned or constructed to approximate the actual function of interest. And it could be differentiable sometimes, but not always. And it usually encodes some sort of prior knowledge or assumptions about the function, and then in the space the domain it operates over. An example is a Gaussian process where, see the red points here are sort of the points that you've observed, and the blue line and the dotted line represents sort of the estimate of function and the uncertainty over how it behaves. Yeah, and you can use different choices of kernels and hyperparameters to encode some sort of assumption about how this function looks. And the second component is a candidate point sampler. So this is a mechanism that is used to propose points that you can evaluate next. So which we denote as tilde h. And for example, in a Gaussian process, which is differentiable, how you can get these candidate points is you can sort of do multiple runs of some sort of stochastic gradient descent type algorithm, and then you can obtain points that could, for example, minimize or maximize this surrogate function. And then afterwards, you use some sort of utility metric that is used to select the candidate point that you actually want to evaluate, and the one that is selected is evaluated, and this whole process repeats. Cool. So if we look at it from another perspective, the problem of Bayesian optimization can be framed as few-shot learning, which is a very similar sort of adjacent field in machine learning. And few-shot learning is something that sort of large language models have done really well. And they're very sort of efficient few-shot learners or in-context learners. And because of the large-scale pre-training that they go through, they oftentimes encode some sort of prior knowledge about the problem space. And another really good thing is because everything is accessed through prompts, now you can sort of incorporate a lot of problem-specific or contextual information into your prediction task. And there was a work recently, and I should have probably added the citation here, which presents LLM and context learning from a Bayesian perspective. And specifically in the context of model-based BO, where you can sort of think about the surrogate model as learning some sort of distribution over the objective value. It's equivalent to, it can be viewed as marginalizing over some sort of latent variable, theta here. And the latent variable encodes some knowledge about the problem space. And to be a bit more specific, theta here would be this more, the sort of knowledge that is already instilled in the model, the large language model, about the problem at hand. And when you look at sort of like that distribution over points that have a certain type of objective value, you can sort of write out something similar. So this is sort of the hypothesis and the premise that the work is sort of based on. Cool. So yeah, so now we'll sort of jump into sort of how we actually translate a lot of these insights into an end-to-end pipeline. And here's an overview. So we'll be stepping through each of these components one by one, but just for a high-level overview, we have the component here, which is used for Warmstarting. And as you can see, it's sort of like the algorithm just sort of produces some good points that you can use to initialize your search process, and is purely based on information about the context and some instructions. And then you have a sort of candidate point sampler. The candidate point sampler, we use a sort of a different technique here where we condition on a S prime, which is an objective value we want. And then we sort of sample from it to get a set of candidates, H tilde. And the surrogate model is takes in each of these candidate points and the historical observations and predicts the mean and uncertainty around each of these candidate points. And after we sort of do this estimation for the entire set of candidate points, then we sort of use a acquisition function, and here we use expected information. And then that is used to select H prime, H star, which is the actual point that we use, and then we evaluate, and then we obtain our new observations, and then it goes around again. And a lot of these is actually implemented. Actually, most of these is implemented. The core function is implemented through sort of prompts, and the prompts generally contain a few key components. But the details will vary. So I would recommend looking at the full prompts that we have in the paper. And one of which is sort of the contextual description. This can include information about the input space, the output space, and the objective function. And the optimization history, which is just some sort of serialization and concatenation of all the points that have been observed in the past during our search. Then some instructions for specific components on how on what the response should be and how it should be formatted. And this is mainly just for engineering, so it's easier to parse and integrate. Cool. So we'll be looking at the Warmstarting bit first. So the point of Warmstarting is really to obtain like diverse and high performing points, and you want to sort of like cover your search space, but you also want points that are pretty good already, and then you can sort of seed your search on these points. And if you do it well, you can sort of have more efficient conversions during the search process. And here we sort of have a skeleton of the kind of prompt that we use, and this is for the task of hyperparameter tuning. And most of this here in the orange and the yellow is just contextual information, like what is the model, what is the task, and what is the metric or the F that we're actually optimizing, and then some information about the data set. And also the hyperparameters of interest and some instructions about what should be done. So the first thing that we wanted to do was we sort of wanted to perform a little bit of a sanity check to see if there is some sort of useful data or prior knowledge about the problem space. And I think this is a pretty good first step when it comes to applying this approach in general, is to actually check that there is something useful that can be solicited somehow. So yeah, that's sort of what the first set of results being shown here are sort of investigating, and we want to see sort of the impact of this warm-side seeding on the search performance. And on this plot here, we sort of have the number of trials on the x-axis and the average regret, average normalized regret across a bunch of tasks here on the y-axis. And we are getting I believe, 10 warm starting points, and that's shown before. And then you sort of fit your model at time equals 0, and then you sort of acquire 25 more points. So that's what this plot is showing. And we sort of have here a few fairly popular random initialization techniques. And in the purple, we have different sort of versions of how the warm starting technique that we're using. And specifically, no context here is referring to sort of not including any sort of information and just basically saying like, hey, give me some good points for this problem, but you don't really describe what the problem is. And the partial context is sort of like you include a little bit of information, and it's a sort of interpolating between the full and the no context. The full context is basically the prompt that I showed before. It has all the contextual information provided. So we notice a couple things. So warm starting, especially with the full context here, really improves search performance. And you can sort of see that, like, especially at the start, it was already starting in a really good place. And it maintains this sort of better search trajectory, kind of, as the algorithm runs over 25 trials. And we also observe that the contextual information really helps. And this is pretty surprising and also very interesting, actually, because it's suggesting that like the task-specific information is leading to better performance of the algorithm in general. And to investigate that a little bit more, we sort of had these few more sort of empirical insights. And what's being shown here on the top is the correlation matrix of the 10 points that we use for warm starting. So here we have sort of each row and column is a hyperparameter, and then each of these cells is a correlation between two pairs of them. And we're basically plotting the correlation matrix and calculating the average correlation. And we see that when you do random initialization, it's fairly random. There doesn't seem to be any sort of pattern or relationship between what it's giving you, and that makes sense because it's some sort of uniform initialization strategy. And the really cool thing is that we see that like when you use the full context, it starts having very sort of highly correlated points or sort of features. And that's kind of intuitive as well, like as sort of like when you sort of get into machine learning a little bit, you sort of develop a lot of these heuristics, right? And then you sort of have these things that you kind of know, like if you're going to use a very deep tree, for example, you better regularize it somehow, and then it's reflected in how you set the other hyperparameters. So I think this is pretty interesting. It indicates that indeed there is some sort of generalized knowledge, and it is somewhat task specific. So like given a particular task, it is able to propose really good hyperparameters. And I think the significance of this is that now you have a very sort of accessible way to obtain this sort of prior information that is very difficult to encode in a regular way, like say using a non-pre-trained or non-meta learned Bayesian optimizer. But here it's like it seems to be some useful correlation and some useful prior knowledge here, and then that's reflected in the search performance as well. And we were also sort of interested in like, oh, how does this impact the diversity of the points that are being sampled? And sort of we use generalized variance here, and then we're sort of comparing the average generalized variance across all the tasks. And we see that the random initialization techniques are pretty, they cover the space very well. So they sort of have a large volume. But then especially when you look at our techniques, when you look at the full context, the diversity is quite low. This is not super surprising because I think it is almost a directly because of the higher correlation. Like with higher correlation, you sort of have less diversity and less sort of rank in your between the points, and then that's so these two things make sense together. But then it is also called for concern because if the diversity is quite low in the initial sample points, that might impact search later on because it will lead to early conversions and those sort of problems. Cool. At this point, I think I'll hand over to Nicholas, who will step us through the rest of these components.
Tenisu, can you go back to the last slide? There was a question. What does this plot actually denote? So what are the X and the Y axis on these plots?
So for this one, each of the rows and columns is a hyperparameter. So if we sample sort of a set of points, and each of these cells is plotting the correlation between these two hyperparameters, and this is just the different initialization techniques, and then the generalized variance across the average generalized variance between the points, and then that's averaged across all the tasks that it was evaluated on.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Cool. Are there any? I can't really see the chat box. I'm assuming there are no more questions, and it's okay to move on.
Yeah, no more questions so far. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. And yeah, I'll hand over to Nicholas. We'll talk about this bit.
So now we are facing the component that is a candidate sampler point component, which is in fact very similar to Warmstarting because we want sample promising candidate points. But now we are also given all the contextual, like historical information that is obtained through this iterative process of the acquisition of hyperparameters and the score that you obtain with the black box. So what is the aim? Is basically sample high candidate points that given all this past information. And how we do this is we follow like an objective condition generation. So we basically want to sample candidate points h tilde given a desired objective x prime and the past observation that we have observed. So at the left there is almost like a distribution perspective from this that is conditional on S prime. But how we construct S prime, we basically, using all this historical information of hyperparameters and score, we constructed this desired objective based on the best scores and the worst score obtained. Why we do this? Because then with an hyperparameter alpha, we can move it such as in certain values, which are I think the positive values, the score, the score is like inside of the range of the score that we have already observed in the past. But if we are a little more greedy and the alpha parameter is positive, then we are trying to achieve scores that are better that we have observed. And this, we hope that like conditioning on better scores, maybe we can sample better hyperparameters. So this is more or less how the prompt looks like. It's very similar to the Warmstarting. We have basically a model. We may want to measure this like using accuracy, and we give a lot of information about classes and number of categorical variables, etc. But then at the end, we start adding the historical information, which is basically we give the performance, the score, follow it by the hyperparameter configuration used to achieve that performance. And we continue doing this until we arrive to the end, and we basically give the performance that we want, and we let the LLM impute or predict the hyperparameter configuration that can achieve that score. So to study qualitatively this, one of the first things what we did was basically let's transform this hyperparameter space into a 2D space with a TSNE, if I don't remember bad. And we see qualitatively what happened when we change the alpha. So in this 2D plot, what we see is like on green, we have good points, which are basically the points that achieve the top 25% of the best objective value observed so far. And the rest are the bad points. And then we have in purple the points that are sampled with this candidate sampler objective, which is a LLAMBO. So at the right, we can see that when alpha is positive, it means that we are being greedy because we want a score that is better or similar to the one that we have achieved. So in this case, the points are more concentrated to some of the green part, some of the good points, and it's like constrained in a more, like, how to say it, in a smaller space. But if we, for example, choose an alpha that is negative, it means that we are being more conservative. So we are choosing a desired score that we have already, that is in the range of the ones that we have already observed so far, then we observe that all the points that we sample with the candidate point sampler step are more spread across the embedding, and not necessarily in the same regions of the good points. So to see this a little bit more quantitatively, we have the left plot. So in the axis, we have how we change it's basically the exploration of the hyperparameter of alpha. And in the top, we have like measures about generalized variance and log likelihood. And in the bottom, we have like metrics about regret and best regret. So we can see that if our intuition is correct, if we increase this hyperparameter alpha, we are being more greedy, but it means also we are constraining the space of the point, which translates into a less generalized variance. And it's also less likelihood because we are out of the density of the data distribution. But this has a trade-off because, for example, if the alpha is too low, it means we are being very conservative, but this means that we are not targeting to a better score, which is translate in a higher regret, which is worse. But if we start to increase the alpha, it means we are a little more greedy, but the score increases. So in the end, alpha smoothly interpolates what is between exploration and exploitation, with higher alpha leading to higher exploitation because we are focusing on a smaller part with lower regret. And lower values tend to lead to higher exploration because we explore all this space a more general space. So there will be a trade-off between exploration and exploitation, and I think in the paper we select an hyperparameter of alpha of 0.01. Yes. Okay, so in addition to that, we compare with other baselines. In the two first plots, also metrics about regret, then the third plot is about generalized variance, and the fourth is about log likelihood. And particularly, we compare with TPE. And one thing that is interesting to say that in TPE, you have also like density of distribution of the good areas and bad areas. So our method is similar in that sense to TPE because we are conditioning the generation on what is good or what is bad. So as a baseline, we use TPE with like independent Gaussians, but also multivariate Gaussian. We use random. And also another, like to ablate a little more LLAMBO, we use like the same LLAMBO, but eliminating the semantic information of the hyperparameter. So when we give it into the text, we eliminate, instead of putting like a number of leaf or the depth of the tree, we just put hyperparameter 1 or 2 to eliminate this contextual information. So we can see that it's like we propose the takeaways of this plot is that we propose points that are high performant and similar to Warmstarting. This is most notable in the low sample regime, and this can be seen in the first two plots where the margin is very high, particularly with LLAMBO with all the contextual information. Of course, this start to shrink or get similar with the baseline as more iterations happen, and also that also is something that we observed that in Warmstarting is that this method achieve lower diversity, which can be seen in the generalized variance plot, but in general, at least the likelihood is conserved across the relevant baselines, which is the fourth plot. Okay, so now we are going to the last component of LLAMBO, which is the surrogate model part, which is basically after we sample these candidate points, we want to evaluate them somehow after that, using this evaluation, give it to the acquisition function. So because we are using expected improvement, we need like two statistics, the mean and the standard deviation. And we took like a very empirical approach, which is basically consists of estimating these statistics using bootstrap Monte Carlo estimation. So we condition the LLM on all this contextual information on the past observation, and we sample many times. And also we permute how the information is given to even give more variability to have a better estimate of the uncertainty. So because calibrated uncertainty is crucial for exploration and exploitation. So this is more or less how the prompt look like. It's very similar to the previous one. We give all the contextual information, and afterward we basically give the historical information saying that this is the hyperparameter configuration. We give the performance of this hyperparameter, and we continue so on until we want to evaluate the hyperparameter that we are evaluating now. And basically, we ask the LLM to predict or impute with the performance of these hyperparameters. So we can condition on this information, and we can repeat the sampling the LLM, and we also can permute it to have better variance. So okay, so from a quantitative perspective, we evaluate this using various metrics of also like root mean square error. In the first plot, we also look the correlation, the regret, the log predictive density, the coverage of the function, and also the sharpness of these standard deviations. So we compare with GP, SMAC, and LLAMBO MC, which is the LLAMBO that does we have sampled many times from the LLM, but we don't permute the contextual information. Contextual information meaning the historical information of the point. So what we can observe is that the surrogate model in general predict the expected the objective value very well, which can be seen in the first plot, which is a root mean square error, achieving lower score, and this also translated in a lower regret, which is in the third plot on the top. However, the uncertainty, it seems to be less calibrated with the GP, which is, it could be seen like maybe like a more principal uncertainty estimation method. And this can be seen in the coverage when the GP has better coverage. And it's also translated when you see the log predictive density in the left plot on the bottom, because in the log predictive density, the LLAMBO and the Gaussian process has similar log predictive density. So basically, and we observe that in general, the LLAMBO, the more complete version of LLAMBO, the one that permutes the contextual information, in general achieve similar results in root mean square error and regret, but the results respect to coverage and log predictive density are very different. So that's are all the components of LLAMBO, and so now we want to evaluate, particularly the candidate sampling point with the surrogate model, how it compares with current benchmarks and baselines. So we evaluate LLAMBO in end-to-end public benchmark, which is Basemark, which was used in the paper of Hibo in the Newdies 2020 challenge, if I remember correctly, and it also using HPO Bench, which is a widely known tabular dataset, and it's faster to run. But also we use, when using Basemark, we use private and synthetic dataset because we want to make sure that all the findings that we found in the paper are not just pure memorization of the LLM, but also are generalizable of contextual information that it has not seen in the past. So we run this method for a total of 79 tasks, and we use 5 seeds per task. And we compare with classical like Bayesian optimization methods like Gaussian process with deep kernel learning, like an improved version. Like we use SMAC, SkyOpt, Optuna, using TPE, the multivariate TPE, and LLAMBO. And we can see that LLAMBO is better than, in general, is better than all the baselines, and particularly is very efficient in the low sample regime. So that's it. That is our presentation. So LLAMBO is basically another framework for Bayesian optimization using large language model. Interestingly, this is also one of the first work that demonstrate that LLMs capabilities in traditional optimization tasks. So maybe a little more ambitious. And I think we can. There are many future directions. For example, extension to other VO tasks like control, experimental design, doing AutoML. You could, for example, create a meta LLAMBO, I think, using like instead of PFN for VO, you could use like an LLM for VO, like in a meta learning way. And many more details in the paper, like generate surrogate model, evaluation on prior, insight into candidate proposal points, more benchmark, and also more baselines, and evaluation of prompt on the prompt component. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you to our sponsors.